All right, so I will go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming today. Today's event we decided would be held on Martin Luther King Jr. Day because he was and is still a civil rights leader, and his legacy allows us to continue the work that he started. And what we must remember is that Dr. King's work and his legacy is not just about passivity, it was about engagement and asserting oneself against oppressive systems. That's why today we have three incredible panelists here to talk about their unique viewpoints based on their lived experiences as a person of color, working and living in a world and a society often plagued by racial inequity. And it's my sincere hope that everyone here is able to learn something today and that we will all leave here a little more inspired and resilient about the future. And without further ado, I want to introduce our speakers for today. And first, we have Professor Aaron Adalja. Aaron Adalja is an assistant professor of food and beverage management at the School of Hotel Administration. He holds a PhD in agricultural and resource economics from the University of Maryland, College Park, and his research interests include a range of topics in food and agricultural economics. Prior to graduate school, Aaron started his professional career out of college working as a product analyst in the financial services sector before studying culinary arts and spending several years working as a chef de partie in the restaurant industry in New York City. Next, we have Jada Robinson. Jada Robinson, class of 18, is a native Washingtonian with a passion for people. Her longing for knowledge and love of hospitality was strengthened at Cornell School of Hotel Administration, where she concentrated in hospitality leadership and minored in intellectual disabilities. Inspired by the political landscape and a thirst for social justice, she participated in a fellowship with Teach for America after graduating to create impact in one of the most underserved communities in Las Vegas, Nevada. While in Las Vegas, Jada worked tirelessly at shaping the young minds of the future while also developing partnerships with hotels and casinos to train and hire adults with developmental disabilities, similar to what she did in Washington, D.C. After a year in Las Vegas, Jada left behind the bright lights and moved to Chicago, Illinois, where she's now an HR business partner with Soho House Chicago, a private members club catered to the creative community. Last but not least, we certainly have Christian Jerome. Christian Jerome, class of 18, grew up surrounded by the fast pace and bright lights of Las Vegas, Nevada. His fascination with hospitality continued and further developed at Cornell School of Hotel Administration, where he concentrated in services marketing and operations management. Upon graduating and accepting an offer with SC Johnson, Christian moved to Bentonville, Arkansas, where he attended his first ever World Championship Squirrel Cook-Off contest as a spectator, and managed Walmart.com, Jet.com, and Walmart online grocery accounts across all SC Johnson brands. After a year in Arkansas, Christian left behind the charming Southern hospitality and culinary marvels of Arkansas and moved to Chicago, Illinois, where he's now the customer marketing manager across all brick and click accounts and the food class of trade for the pest control and home cleaning businesses at SC Johnson. All right, so I'm very, very excited to have everyone here today, and we will have, as Carl wrote in the chat, a section at the end for a Q&A. And now I just want to get the conversation started with our very first question to all three of our panelists, and you can go and answer in whichever order you'd like. So the first question I have is, when was a time that you've advocated for difficult conversations or even faced hostility for an identity that you have? And how did you overcome these challenges?
I can start. So this is kind of challenging for me. I really thought hard about this when you posed the question, because you know, I grew up when I was raised in sort of a rural area of the United States, Western Pennsylvania, and I didn't. I guess my parents mostly assimilated when they moved here, so I was really kind of for all intents and purposes, I didn't really think of myself any differently than anybody else that I was around. But it was clear to me that obviously other people saw me differently than any of the than themselves. And so I think for the majority of my life, at least growing up, I kind of thought of I really didn't consciously think about identity or about having a different identity, until it sort of manifested in little microaggressions or little types of behaviors that at the time I never thought much of, and now sort of looking back, especially Abby, based on your prompt, thinking back to it, being passed over for simple things when in groups at school, or thinking about ways that, well, I'm trying to give you a specific example, and it's really challenging because it's kind of, I think I sort of in naturally sort of stop or put a lot of it out of my mind, but I think let me I'm kind of at a loss for words, but let me think for 1 second. I think the most recent sort of occurrence, the most recent time that I very specifically remember having or facing hostility was when I was in grad school. I never, again, like I said, I grew up and I always thought of myself as having a or sort of a majority identity because of the way that I was sort of assimilated as a child, and it didn't really hit home concretely until I was in grad school, and I very distinctly remember walking back to the public transportation system, the metro system, and being essentially followed by a car with a bunch of guys in it, white male guys in it, and basically having them yell stuff at me as I walked back. And at first, I was so surprised because, again, I told you, in my mind, I never really thought of having a separate identity. I was so surprised that I was looking around trying to figure out who could they possibly be yelling these things, yelling things at, various obscenities and things of that nature. And then, it took several laps around the block for me to realize that, oh, wait a minute, they're actually addressing me when they're saying this. And I was so shocked that anybody actually, or that, it was such a sort of disconnect for me that I had any sort, or that I was viewed in any identity different than sort of just anyone else, that it kind of, that was the turning point for me, where I sort of started to objectively, or I should say explicitly, think about it and realize it. And I have to admit, I was pretty naive and pretty I guess sheltered about it, or I just kind of dismissed it in my mind for much of my life until that incident. I know that's not exactly answering your question, but that's I guess the thing that stands out in my mind the most.
No, you're absolutely right there. There's always a sense of othering that can be felt, and sometimes it's not very transparent until something like that happens to you. So I definitely want to appreciate that, and thank you for sharing that. Jada and Christian, do you have something that you want to say as well?
Can you refresh me on the question, like the verbiage exactly?
Yeah, of course. When was a time that you have advocated for difficult conversations or even faced hostility for an identity that you have, and how did you overcome these challenges? It's a bit of a mouthful.
Do you want to go first, Jada?
Sure. I was thinking about this question a lot as well, and I think back to my childhood where because I am Black and I grew up with two older brothers, it was very much a conversation that my mom had with us a lot of when you are faced with these challenges, or when you're in these situations, or if you see the police, or if you do these things, be aware, and don't have those conversations, more so walk away and deal with it within yourself mentally afterwards. So I think the first situation that was the most prevalent in my adult life that wasn't necessarily intentional hostility was when I was first starting at Soho House, and at first, I wore braids, or I wore weaves or whatever to fit a certain profile. And one day I was like, you know what, I'm just going to wear my natural hair. And a lot of kind of questions came of that, of oh, well, I thought this was your natural hair, or a lot of very invasive microaggression-y type things came up. So that's when, I mean, if you know me, I'm more of a docile person, so I would kind of bite my tongue and walk away. But in that moment, it was happening so much that it was okay, how do I educate these people to understand that it's not something as serious as that. You have to constantly point it out. You have to constantly try to make me aware of something that I'm very much in tune with because it is a part of who I am. So that was probably one of the difficult conversations I had, because it was a lot, even though we catered to a lot of minority demographics, some of the people who worked, especially in the front facing or guest facing positions, were white or white passing during like the day parts. So having that conversation and like really having them think about how they approached me in a different way was kind of difficult for me to have, and not having had that conversation prior and being taught to kind of walk away from those situations previously. Not really sure if that answered your question, but yeah.
No, it absolutely does. Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I think this is a really interesting question to like unpack. It's very nuanced. And particularly because hostility can manifest itself in multiple ways, right? You have the very blatant hostility when people are calling you names or making a point to exclude you, and then you have subliminal hostility that's more kind of sleeping through the cracks. So I think in my position, I'm in a unique position because, as Jada mentioned, there's a spectrum, right? I'm white passing to the common person that walks by. I have color privilege. I look like I'm a white man. For people that maybe don't have experience in understanding like different facial features or things like that. So I've faced hostility from both ends of the spectrum. I've faced hostility from my own culture, right? Like I think about when I go to Latino markets or Latinx markets, and there's people there that look typically Latinx, right? And they have conversations not realizing that I'm part of the culture and I understand the language, and I very much realize that they're talking about me. And they're saying that this white guy doesn't know what he's doing, he's gonna need help, I don't wanna help him. And it's always a moment of, I get very excited to answer them back in Spanish and to tell them that I know exactly what they're talking about and that I don't need help. It's kind of that satisfaction that I'm proving you wrong, right? Even at the hotel school, I've had an administrator, I became president of the National Society of Minorities in Hospitality, right? And for one administrator, it particularly didn't make sense why I was going to be the president of the Minority Society. So this person decided to pull me aside and have a conversation with me, and they're like, I don't get it. What's your deal? Like, what's the angle here, right? And to me, I was like, there is no angle. This is my identity. This is who I am. It's part of who I want to be or who I am, and I'm trying to help, right? So it's like having a lot of conversations. And then on the opposite, it's almost like I'm too Latinx or Latino for white people, and I'm too white for Latinx people. And it's a weird straddling of two cultures because I am white passing, where I face hostility in multiple places, but it's manifested for me in those subtle ways that they don't realize that they're talking to someone that's a person of color, so they make comments, even at work. Right after you mentioned, when you were talking briefly about each of the panelists, you mentioned that I worked in Arkansas, right? And so like you can imagine, Arkansas is a very particular kind of place to work and operate in. The culture is very old school, to say the least. And to them, they're being perfectly normal, right? And they're having conversations with me about how race relations in the US have just made it difficult for them to live their lives because they're good people and they don't see color, right? And that's a comment that to them seems like they're allies. But to me, as a person of color, not seeing color and saying something like that is part of the issue. You're not acknowledging that there's adversity that we face as people of color that you won't because of the color of your skin. So it's been an interesting journey so far in corporate America and even in academia, where I've kind of experienced it in a more subliminal way.
It's a great answer. Thank you, Christian. My second question is, how did you find a community to share some of these challenges and experiences with, if you found one? I know, at least for me growing up, I went to a predominantly white school, but I did manage to find, a pretty strong Indian community, and I was able to bond through cultural values and shared experiences. What was that like for you all?
Sorry.
Go ahead, Jada.
I think it goes back to so in the hotel school, like when I looked around, like there were very few people that looked like me, and that I felt that I could really share in that experience with. And then it became a matter of not actively trying to find someone that looked like me to share in those experiences to overcome the situations, but someone who could relate or who I could talk to, who I could confide in, and that I felt wouldn't judge me in that situation. And I found a lot of that in the National Society of Minorities and Hospitality, specifically at Cornell, and in a lot of people outside of the hotel school. Um, and it was more of a understanding of who I was as a person, what I needed to kind of feed my soul and to make it through those 4 years. When I looked around and I felt like no one would ever understand what I was going through, what I went through, what it took for me to get to this situation. And it was completely different from my high school. My high school, there was 200 kids and they were all people of color. We all lived in the same neighborhood. We all like did the same thing. So it was definitely a huge culture shock, but finding solace in that organization. And like Christian, he was one of the people that I spent the last, how long has it been since we graduated? Ever since freshman year, like he's been that person for me, and like the groups of friends and people that we were able to, or I was able to build that sense of community with, really helped me through.
I was gonna add, you know, when I was growing up, like you, Abby, I went to I was in an area, a rural area, so I think, you know, the only Indians there were doctors. Our parents were physicians. We didn't really have a strong, a close connection to that community. So for me, I think the people that I ended up connecting with were sort of people who um, didn't fit in some other sort of way. So I ended up when I grew up, I spent a lot of my time in high school skateboarding, actually. And the skateboarders back then, this is, you know, back in the 90s, we were all like the misfits, right? Um, didn't, you know, there wasn't necessarily people with different people of color or anything like that, but they were just people who, for one reason or another, kind of weren't part of the mainstream crowd. And that those folks ended up being uh, you know, that ended up being sort of my solace, is just hanging out with. And it was funny because, you know, I was one of these students that was like an overachiever. So I was part of the, you know, what we had this, it was a public high school, we had like this gifted program, and you know, all those folks kind of hung out together. And I never really spent time with anybody that I was actually in classes with. The people I spent time with outside of school were all the people who were all these skateboarders, and we all just hung out. And it was sort of, everybody kind of wondered why I never hung out with any of them, but it was just like the people that I identified with were these people that had something that was sort of, you know, they didn't see themselves fitting into some, you know, some sort of traditional or mainstream group. And I think that kind of united us in a way. So even though there weren't really people that looked like me, they're people that I felt like I identified with on that more sort of philosophical level.
I mean, I echo both sentiments from like Jada and Professor Anshala. Is that how you say your name? Sorry.
You can just call me Aaron. That's fine.
Aaron, excellent. So, I mean, I think it was a little bit of like the Goldilocks tale for me, right? Like you try to go to one group, you see if you can fit in, you see if you relate, it doesn't work out. You go to another group and you kind of find your footing. And eventually I was left with, as Aaron said, a group of misfits where we all had similar narratives and similar stories, right? Where you find that consistent motif of, I don't quite fit in here, I don't fit in here, but I have these similar adversities, right? And I mean, like, I think Cornell is a perfect place to make those connections because you're all going through a massive hurdle together, which is like the Ithaca winter, the struggle of the courses, a completely new way of life. And so the environment lends itself, if you're open-minded, to find people that maybe don't look like you, but share similar struggles and are willing to have the same mission in life, right? And whether that be to, you know, make the world a better place or to advance, you know, in a certain career field, I think those ideologies, as Aaron mentioned, is what ends up bringing your group together and what worked for me and how I found my people.
That's great. Thank you. We have a question that was sent in as a DM, and I initially was planning on doing questions at the end as like a different section, but I like the inflow of questions as it's coming, so I'm just going to ask it now. So this question is, how does BIPOC or BIPOC and being a marginalized group fare in the hospitality industry as opposed to other industries? Are there any tips or recommendations for a Black person or POC to climb up the corporate ladder in hospitality?
So I can take a stab at this. And me and Shada talk about this all the time. I mean, we're roommates now in Chicago, and we're both in the corporate world. Representation is sparse, okay? Whether it be in corporate America or in hospitality and finance and whatever, right? And there's kind of, I'm in marketing, so I like to always use marketing examples. HP, the tech company, did a case study not too long ago. And they went around and they asked, I think it was like 500 different people, what they thought a Latinx job was. And it was random people on the street of all types of ethnicities. And the answers ended up coming back. And I think like 90% of the time, people answered with a Latinx person is a maid, a Latinx person is someone that cuts your grass, as a construction worker. It was all these manual labor intensive jobs, right? So as a society, right, we can take that case study and kind of apply it to the corporate world, no matter what field you're in. As a society, we have a bias towards understanding that certain cultures will be in certain roles, right? Like when you think of someone in the Latinx field working in hospitality, more often than not, a common person is going to think that they're the maid or that they're the housekeeper. Or maybe they've climbed their way up in housekeeping and they're a higher level of housekeeping. So I think it's important to be aware of those biases and to be willing to challenge them head on, right? You need to have those conversations. And I'll share another quick anecdote. I'll never forget when I transitioned to our corporate office in Chicago. There was a group of marketers. They were all older white men, and they were discussing how we were going to capitalize on the minority market, on Black consumers and on Latinx consumers. And they had pitched an ad that just simply wasn't going to work. Like I could have told them that. And I sat there around the table and we were going and sharing stories one by one and giving our review. And, you know, it was a little intimidating to be the one person. As their stories kept trickling in, I was like, no, they got it all wrong. What do you mean? Like, this isn't going to work. No, that's wrong. This is borderline offensive. And it was very challenging to get to me, the youngest person in the room, and also to identify myself as a minority, because I discussed prior how, you know, not often am I identified as a minority, and to say, hey, you've got it wrong, and let me tell you why. So there's kind of, you need to pick and choose your battles to educate and to, you know, understand and to let people know that you can be a subject matter expert, but you cannot speak for the entire community, that you're giving them your own personal opinion based off of your experiences, and that you simply don't think it's going to work. And I think as you continue to voice that and as you continue to fight and bring it to the forefront of people's minds, that's how you start becoming a thought leader and you start climbing up in your organization, no matter what field you're in. But that's my non-HR perspective. I don't know if there's other thoughts.
I was going to echo off of that. Like, yeah, making it known, like really echoing off of what Christian said, but also from like the HR perspective and like, especially when you come to like the lower level positions, like there's an automated process for that. And like, there's an automated screening. And then when you get to those higher positions, that's when it's more personal from the initial process. And so like word of wisdom is essentially like coming over prepared to whatever interview, whatever situation you're walking into, because when, like what Christian was saying, when they look at you and they have these implicit biases already, being able to prove that you are that subject matter expert, no matter what field you're going into, no matter what job you're applying for, and showing that like you did all the work, that's gonna begin to set you apart from someone who is not that minority, who maybe doesn't have to come as prepared, but because it's either that situation of groupthink, or it's a buddy, or they look like them so they feel more comfortable. You always have to be aware of those biases and make sure that you are coming with the most information possible to make it known that you are the best fit for that position.
I don't necessarily feel like I have the solution, but I think you guys both found really important points. And I think, one thing, my background in hospitality is in fine dining, and I think it's not a secret that there's very little representation in fine dining. You walk into any high-end kitchen, you'll be lucky if you see one person of color in the back of the house, or front of the house for that matter. Other than maybe the dishwashers, and it's sort of, and I'm not, it's not clear to me exactly what the solution is. I think, I think we're seeing a positive improvement in the sense that as younger generations of chefs come up the lines, we're starting to see a more inclusive environment, and an environment that sort of welcomes people of color. But I think it's a long way off in terms of the current titans of the industry, especially at least in fine dining. There's not, there's still a long way to go in terms of those folks sort of and not at the rate it's going, it seems like it's going to take a while. And there needs to be I felt like there was a reckoning a few years ago when there's an organization called Restaurant Opportunity, Rock United, and they published a report about this in fine dining, and that was back in, I think, 2008 or 2009, and I felt like that was sort of like a reckoning or a watershed moment where we were going to see this massive transition, and it really never happened, which it was kind of disheartening. But I don't really know I don't have a good sort of approach or answer to how we address that. Obviously, starting with acknowledging it is probably a good thing, which I would wager to say that there are a lot of folks that don't really acknowledge it. But yeah, I don't have much else to say there.
No, you make a great point in that, like, the first step is acknowledging it and then taking action to try to eventually find a solution. And I think that helps me kind of transition to my next question, which is similarly toned, but about a different concept where, especially reflecting on what happened in the Capitol on January 6th, how can we challenge white supremacy while in the roles that we hold, whether it's, at a big corporation or, in the industry, or even, being a teacher or a professor at the hotel school?
So I get from the academic standpoint, I think it's as professors, we're always these conversations are generally not the most comfortable conversations to have in a group setting. But I think now is the time, especially after January 6th. It's so much on the forefront of what's going on. It's right on the surface at this point. As instructors and as teachers, we would be doing all of you a tremendous disservice if we didn't make this a conversation in every one of, and it doesn't matter what class. It doesn't matter if we're talking about accounting or food and beverage or finance or whatever it may be. There's something to be talked about in every one of those classes. And I think pushing those, my goal as an instructor going forward is to just even push myself beyond my comfort level to have these conversations in class. That's, like I said, the first step is acknowledgement. And as an academic institution, the sort of core of that is having a conversation around it. There's a lot of people that maybe are not as educated. Everybody that leaves this school should be intimately educated about this type of information, or this type of thing. And I challenge myself and everyone else to do a better job of making that a priority. It's not just a line item on a syllabus for a day of class or something. It needs to be something that's integrated into curriculum. Every discussion has an opportunity. in every piece of material and every discussion, we've got an opportunity to essentially address something related to this. It's not hard. I mean, you don't have to look far to find examples to spark a discussion. And like I said, the challenge starts with myself, because I know I certainly have not done the best job of that, but I think that's really where I see my role as an instructor at this stage.
Yeah, and I think you make a really great point. I mean, from even taking some of your courses in the hotel school, like you've been able to mention resources relevant to your industry, where you mentioned this one website, I believe it was called Equity at the Table, where you're able to find people of color and marginalized groups and organizations who are succeeding in this industry, and they can network with one another. And finding that website was really great for me, because it allowed me to kind of expand my knowledge. And I think that's what all professors and everyone in academia should be striving to do. Christian and Jada, your thoughts?
I think from my perspective, especially being in HR, it's really interesting to kind of think about how to go on and deal, especially like when considering the events that happened at the Capitol. And there's just like, especially in the companies that I've worked for, this weird notion of, okay, you don't talk about politics at work. And when you think about it that way, you can basically tie everything back to like something related to politics, right? Like, and when the events happened and I was working and I was my family still lives in Washington D.C., so naturally I was fearful that I was trying to check in on them, and I was making sure that like my mom was checking in on my great grandmother and all of these things, making sure my mom didn't go to work, what have you. And I expressed my concerns to like my peer person, and she started to talk about it, and she was like, oh no, we just don't talk about politics at work. And it kind of threw me for this loop, and I was just like, I'm sharing like genuine concerns about like the livelihood of people. It's not anything like, yes, it was politically charged, but this is something that's affecting people, like everyday people. And it just really frustrated me. It made me very angry. And when you think about um these things at work, when you're in the workplace, obviously if you are a person who like has these strong opinions, you don't explicitly state them at work. They come in the form of microaggressions and hostility and all of these other culmination of things that can really push someone over the edge. So like in the HR space, that's when they came in to like these bias tweakers is what they call them. And you try to intervene in these little ways to kind of prevent these microaggressions and these unconscious bias and these racial profilings from occurring. But that's just not enough. Like there's no way that because you automate the applicant system, you still are hiring people with this implicit bias that you don't trust them enough to handle the applicants on their own, right? And it's in my position, me being a minority, I can look, but then where does my alternative bias come from? Like, I want to hire more minorities, right? But am I hiring because you're a minority because you can actually do the job? Like, I want to make it 50-50. I want to minimum, right? I want it to be equal access for all. So it's kind of weird, kind of trying to figure out how to combat that in the workplace. And like all of these companies do this unconscious bias training, and they leave it at that. And at the unconscious bias training, that should be the start for a discussion further. That should not be it. You should also have someone professional doing this. And a lot of the times you don't. And handling all of the employee relations aspects of these microaggressions and the claims that come through, like it's just a never ending onslaught of information and stimulus that I feel like it's never addressed correctly in HR overall. So like what I try to do is when I handle recruiting and when I'm dealing with employers or like having those employee relations or dealing with issues that arise because of someone felt uncomfortable at work, it's really like, I don't know, like taking the time to actually listen to what that person is saying and tackling that information and handling it as soon as possible, because a lot of those things can fester and you just create that hostile work environment. Like your job, especially my job in HR, should be to create that safe space. And in my experience, a lot of the HR people do not do that, especially when they have their own biases. And I'm not really sure how overall to fix that, which really frustrates me. But I know starting with me is making those little changes into the ways we work to kind of move forward, and like in every company that I come across, to kind of move forward and make change in that aspect without trying to speak for my entire group of people.
Yeah, I think, Abby, this is an extremely challenging question, right? Like, how do we end white supremacy? Like, if we only knew. But to me, okay, so I harp on representation a lot because I think representation is how we start turning the tides, right? Like, I single-handedly, as the one Latinx voice at my company, cannot make a huge wave. I can make a ripple. But if I get 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, and it doesn't have to be another Latinx person, it can be an ally. It can be someone like Jada, that's a Black woman. It could be another white man. It could be anybody. You need to find allies and start making sure that you're represented. Whether you want to be, the voice of change, or you want to find someone that you think is a better fit to be the voice of change, but you need to do that in the workforce, at least I found. And again, it's like leveraging your own social capital, right? Like, I at work have built a reputation for myself. And so I've accumulated social capital, right? Dollars, let's say. So if I have $5, I need to make sure that I'm using my $5 in a way that's mindful to bring up other people that I know are going to make a difference in the right direction. So whether that be to supporting a candidate that's applying, to giving a recommendation, to making an introduction, whatever that may be, I need to be very cognizant of that. And that's unfortunately a burden that I carry. And I think a lot of us at Cornell, or that graduated from Cornell, that are educated and going into these spaces that weren't necessarily built for us, will carry for some time until we have representation. And I'm not saying that everybody has to do something with that burden, but I'm saying that it would be nice and it would make a difference if we can leverage that and to continue to push for what we want, which would be equity across the board. I think one of the things, when you're all students, so I think about this at my time at Cornell, one of the things I wish I would have done was to call out certain things that happened in lectures, or certain comments that were made that I maybe necessarily didn't call out, right? So I think oftentimes it's very difficult to create a curriculum, to create a lecture, to be mindful enough to take into account every single person's perspective that's in the room, right? That's never going to happen. It's a perfect world if it did. But I think it's very important that as students, if a professor says something that bothers you or that you don't think is necessarily right, you need to speak up about it. Whether it be one-on-one after class, or if you want to be bold and raise your hand, the professor shouldn't be retaliating against you because it's something that was genuinely a concern of yours. And that happens across the board. It's not going to be a direct insult, again. It's going to be these microaggressions, or maybe it's something that was a learning curve for you, right? I think about the hotel school, and one of the negative connotations that comes from it is elitist, right? I think we hear that a lot as hoteliers, that the hotel school is very elite. It's a group of students that we're all kind of groomed to go there. And we talk about very elite things in class, and that's true. I remember being in hotel ops and discussing properties like the Ritz-Carlton and the Four Seasons and fine dining even, right? What if there's things like for example, sous vide, right? Not everybody's gonna know the cooking mechanism or the method of how to sous vide something. So it's important as a student, if you don't know, raise your hand and say, hey, professor, like, I'm not acquainted with this. I think you should be a little bit more cognizant next time that not everybody in the room has gone to 3-star restaurants across the board. Not everybody has had the privilege of staying at a Four Seasons or a Ritz-Carlton. And that's a little bit more specific to the hotel school. But I think there's, again, a burden on the student to call it out, and a burden on the professor to kind of go back and kind of exercise that empathy and say, if I were in somebody else's shoes from rural Western Pennsylvania, like Aaron, or like Jada, from a lower SES community, would I understand the material or would I not? And if you have a question there, or if you're even asking yourself that, you kind of need to take a couple steps back and revisit and see what you can do and ask questions to get the material to where it can be relatable to everybody.
Excellent response. I wouldn't change that answer for anything. It's great, great stuff. This next question is pretty personal to me because obviously this event is something I've been working on for a while. So I'll just read it out. This panel is titled, "We Are Here," to assert the fact that no matter how many times people are pushed back or marginalized or are found struggling, you get back up again. And my question to you is, when was a time that you had to get back up again and assert your presence and just like fight back?
So in the workforce, I mentioned that I'm like one of the few Latinx people at my company. And I also talked about representation and how it matters, right? So I remember in the summer when, BLM was a hot topic, or Black Lives Matter. And my company is very conservative and they didn't want to launch a statement, right? And ultimately it's a privately held company. So, I mean, there's nothing we can do. But there was something that I wanted, and I wanted to be heard, and I wanted to be heard because representation and allyship matter. So I wanted to make sure that those that I had surrounded myself with knew that I was an ally and that we needed to voice our concerns. So, I mean, again, it's just that matter of like speaking up, and like I set aside a meeting with my manager and I told him, BLM shouldn't be a controversial topic to discuss at work, kind of like when Shada was talking about. Black Lives Matter because they matter, and that's that. And, he had a lot of questions, and I kind of took him through my answers or what I thought like should be a point. And he was like, thank you for taking the time and educating me. Like, I really understand. I hope you know that I consider myself an ally too. And I don't know. I think those conversations are important and to carve out space for that. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, and I can certainly relate. I have dealt with the same questions and answers, and even putting out a statement with HEC, and trying to figure out what was political or what was good enough to say, and those kinds of struggles. So I absolutely relate to that.
Yeah, and it's hard because you get kind of pushed down, right? And it's not like someone's literally saying like, no, you're wrong. It's just a matter of like bureaucracy sometimes and treading a fine line that we need to be crafty and find the right way to go about it to really make sure that we're heard.
I'm really thinking about this question a lot because, like, I can think of a lot of times where I had to like get back up and prove either to myself or to other people in the room or what have you that like I am here, like my voice will be heard, like my voice is important. Um, I think a time that I did this, and like this is something that I don't think was super, super impactful in the grand scheme of things, but it made impact in my workplace and for the people that I like now consider friends from my job. And it was something as simple as like for Black History Month, for example, with Soho House, they had been open for 6 years and not once did they celebrate a Black History Month, Hispanic Heritage Month, Asian Heritage Month, like anything. And it was listening to like the people around me and hearing them talk about how they were either disgruntled or they didn't feel like their voices were being heard, they didn't feel appreciated, which was really interesting considering that a lot of our employee base and our members are minorities. And so it was a matter, I guess, of like just having those conversations with my team. And like I always felt like I could go to my team, but when it came to things dealing with race, it always felt like a dirty word to talk about with the people in my office because it was not something that was ever explicitly stated. But it was a matter of like making sure that I had to look at it from the perspective of it's not my voice that needs to be heard, it's everyone else's. And that kind of helped me through that situation and tackling that tough conversation of like, this is a part of like who they are as people, or like their culture, or what they need to kind of feed their soul. So this is something that we should be implementing, and without feeling like I was speaking on behalf of my entire like population of people, which was kind of difficult. But yeah, just kind of like what Christian was saying, making sure that like the people who it was not only my job to support because I was in HR, but because I consider these people friends, like who am I to know that I have that position of power and to go and like enact this change and still not do anything about it. So like making sure that little things were enacted here and there that kind of really built up and made a difference in the workplace for them.
This is a challenging question because it's hard for me to think about. I feel like I've occupied this space for most of my life where I come from Indian descent. We're sort of thought of as this model minority, and I've often sort of often given me own sort of privilege, which is that people have their certain associations. So they think you're smart, they think you're this, they think you're that. So you kind of benefit from some of that. And I guess, so I feel like the role that I've felt most comfortable in is trying to use that to advocate for others in a way, so I think not so much fighting back from my own perspective as much as trying to say, listen, look, there's this other person right here that has a good idea, and why are you asking me? Why are you coming to me to ask a question, thinking that I have the answer? Maybe you have some certain associations with my identity that make you think I have the answer, and that's kind of the position that I find myself in more often than not, is trying to kind of straddle that identity. And but this is a challenging one. I can't give you a really specific example, and as much as I rack my brain, when you asked the question, I got nervous trying to think about a good answer, and I don't really have one. But I think part of the reason I don't really have one is because of the fact that I've managed to kind of I always feel uncomfortable thinking about, when I think about being a person of color, I feel like in a lot of ways I don't bear as much of the sort of bias that I think others do. And so in my mind, I always feel like there has to be a way for me to, if I don't bear as much of the bias, there has to be a way for me to be more of an advocate. And that's sort of the thing. That's what I constantly struggle with when I think about my role in when it comes to being a person of color.
No,
So I know that doesn't
absolutely.
answer your question, but that's what's been going on in my head as Christian and Jada have been speaking.
No, I mean, you totally make a great point. And, some of the best ways to be a leader is to let others take the reins. And I really appreciate you being so honest about it. And I definitely have had those same experiences. So I wanted to validate that. Thank you for sharing that.
Can I add something real quick, Abby?
Absolutely.
So thinking of this question from the lens of a student that went to Cornell as like a BIPOC student, I think that was a major hurdle that you faced, right? Like you have this imposter syndrome. You go there and you're not like everybody else, or maybe you didn't have personal tutors, or you didn't have these things, or you don't have the new shiny thing at the hotel school. Everybody has nice things all the time. So I think those little adversities, those little hurdles, it's just a mentality thing. Like you need to continue to fight for what you think is right and what you believe in. And eventually you look back and you realize that you conquered your hurdles and you overcame your adversity. And it's just a lot of things happen and you just need to keep your eyes on the goal and continue to fight.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. We have a couple more questions. One question that was sent in as a DM was, what steps do you all suggest we take when looking for employment to include D&I into our strategy when choosing our next employer, especially when the job market is slim and little, so where/how does D&I fit in? That's a very wordy question, but I'm paraphrasing here.
I'm sorry, can you read that one more time?
Yeah, I'll read it. Basically the question is like, what steps do you take when looking for employment to include D&I in your strategy of like choosing your next employer, especially when the job market is so slim? At least for me, when I was recruiting for a full-time position, D&I was definitely there in my mind, but it certainly couldn't be at the forefront because of the fact that I was looking for a job, you know, rather than like looking for a job that fits X, Y, Z criteria.
So I interpret this question in two ways. One, like, how do you, it's like dating, right? Like, you're going to date your company. And you need to make sure that they have certain qualifications and they meet certain standards that you have. That's one way of interpreting the question, right? Like, how do I vet my company to have the correct D&I standards? And that's extremely difficult to do because every company is going to tell you that they are perfect and that they do all that they can to make sure that diverse talent is accepted and improved. And you know, we do all that we can to make sure you're comfortable and you have a platform. So that's extremely difficult. You're going to have to do some sleuthing and some research on that. And at the end of the day, to be completely frank and transparent with you, no company's perfect. And given the job market right now and the world that we're living in, it might very well be that you need to go into a place that you're going to be a little bit uncomfortable in and try to be the change that you wish to see. Just being completely transparent and honest with you. Much like Abby, at the forefront of my mind was not D&I when I was recruiting. It's kind of something that I fell into once I got my job. Once I had a secure spot, I said, okay, now that I'm here, I'm going to be heard. How am I heard? I'm going to join the Business Council for minorities. I'm going to pass initiatives. I'm going to continue to challenge our procedures and our theories and our ideologies at the company. I think it's a lot easier to make change like that. The other part of the interpretation of the question that I had was, how do you leverage your minorityism to, you know, give you a different perspective? This is something that's very challenging to do because you don't want to tokenize yourself. And that's something you want to walk away from. But you also do want to say, like, for example, for me, in the marketing space, I'm well-versed in the Latino community, in the Latinx community, because I am part of the community. I grew up in that community. Cleaning products, what I sell every day, I mean, I know them like the back of my hand. We have routines and rituals in our communities and culture on how we clean. So I can tell you, Windex, I know the scent like the back of my hand because I smelt it every Sunday morning. You know, it's things like that where you go into interviews and you bring your whole self, and that's how you market yourself. And that's how you inculcate and kind of instill that you're a candidate, you're a diverse candidate, so you bring a different perspective that they may not have, that they can leverage to benefit yourself and to benefit them. But it takes some finessing. You can't just go in there and be like, hey, I'm a minority, so I deserve the spot, right? I think Jada alluded to this before. From an HR perspective, yes, you want to be inclusive and you want to have diverse talent, but you don't want them to just check a box and say, okay, I'm going to hire this person because they're Asian, because they're Black, because they're Latinx. So it's you need to be mindful and craft that narrative that you bring a different perspective that's going to be able to be leveraged, and then you make change once you get in my opinion.
I mean, yeah, I would definitely echo and agree. I feel like I said that a lot. What Christian has said, yeah, you're gonna have to prioritize what you really want in your company, especially in the limited job space that we're all currently in, and really like think about like things that are important to you that like Christian saying that you can change once you're there, that you can be the voice of reason for. It doesn't necessarily have to be there initially, because for almost every company it wasn't there initially and someone brought that on, someone made that change. So thinking about it from that perspective, I think is super important. And then in terms of like the marketing yourself aspect, I think it goes back to what I was saying about kind of like being in that over prepared aspect. Like, you're not trying to tokenize yourself because you are the minority, but speaking that like you are that subject matter expert, and like whether you're faking it till you make it or what have you, like going in there as prepared as you can be without like explicitly saying like, hey, I'm a minority, I can bring these things to the table. It's, I can bring these things to the table and I happen to be a minority.
It's been so long since I've been on a traditional job market that I'm not sure I have much too much that's maybe as relevant as what Christian and Jada had to say here. I think you know, I was so just this came to my mind as I was speaking. I just realized, so the first company I worked for out of college as an analyst, this is the first year that they have Martin Luther King Jr. Day off. It was never a thing there. So I was reflecting on that earlier today. Just like I never even the notion that it took until 2021 for something like that to change in a major Fortune 500 company is pretty remarkable. It's staggering to me to think about that. But I think in the current job market, I think Christian's advice, when I was coming out of college, it was really about prioritizing I was prioritizing getting a job in order to essentially use that as a stepping stone to the perfect job that I maybe wanted after that. And I think you got to give yourself a little bit of slack there. If you're a person of color and you think you really want to focus on D&I initiatives, I think it's much easier to do that once you have a job, I guess, is the first point to make. I remember back when I was in undergrad, my one of my finance professors back then, he's I was talking about wanting to go and get into development economics and stuff. He's like, it's a lot easier to make a change once you've worked, once you've made a little bit of money. You'll have much more flexibility to do these things that you want to do. And he was trying to convince me that, at that point, he was convincing me not to go directly back to grad school. He was convincing me to work for a few years in order to kind of provide myself with the ability to do that in a much more successful way. And to an extent I agree, which is that if you especially in a tight job market like this, you want to put yourself in a position where you need to be thinking long term. Give yourself a little bit of slack on the D&I side to think, all right, I'm not planning for the next year. I'm planning for the next 15 years. So you want to set yourself up on a trajectory that's going to allow you to have the impact you want to have in the long term. So I think keeping that mindset when you're looking for your first job and especially your generation, I have friends that I went to college with that started out of college at the same company I was at and are still there, like 20 years later, which is crazy. And that was a different time where it's like the job you got was the job you kept. That's not how it is anymore. So I don't think you need to think so fatalistically about, this job has to check off all these boxes and be perfect. Take what you can from it and use it to leverage yourself into the position you want to be in afterwards. Don't think about it as the end. That's my old man advice. I mean, I'm not that old, but that's my old man advice.
Well, thank you for sharing, everyone. I have one quick last final question. And I just wanted to say it's been an absolute blessing to have you all here. I really appreciate you taking the time out, especially when we don't have our semester started yet. And I just wanted to say thank you again for joining us. The final question I have is, what is a piece of advice you would share with your younger self?
So I've been doing some applicant interviews. I did them yesterday, and I was going down memory lane, and a lot of them asked this question, if you could go back, what would you do differently? And I was like, boy, what would I do differently? So I think I'm a little prepared for this one. So number one, be yourself unapologetically so, no matter where you are. And that kind of is in that thread of everything that I've shared, right? If you don't know something in class, raise your hand, because there's probably something that someone else that doesn't know it. Like, be yourself unapologetically so. Once you have that and you learn how to do that, you gain a certain confidence to yourself that is very intoxicating. People love that. People want to be around genuine people, and it helps you continue to grow and improve on who you are. So I think, as I mentioned before, when I first got to Cornell, there was a lot going on. Like, it was the first time in my life where I had full autonomy. You know, I think in high school, you learn how to be very monotonous, and you have a goal, and you're going to go to college, and you're going to have a great life. But we don't talk about the 4 years of college that are extremely transcendental. So be yourself unapologetically so. Be honest with yourself. Try everything and fail hard. Like, everything that you can do, don't be afraid to fail. And if you're going to fail, go big or go home, right? Like, make sure that you fail as hard as you possibly can, because that's going to give you direction and let you know who you are and where you need to go. And I think that's going to pay out in dividends.
Yeah, so I also kind of hopped on those calls with Christian too. So been saying this for the past couple of days, but my first one is definitely like take every opportunity as they come. Like when I was in my freshman year specifically, like I felt like it took me a lot longer to get to the person I wanted to be because I was so afraid of someone outing me, like you're not supposed to be here, or I was afraid of failing, and I was afraid of so many things that it really just prevented me from having the college experience that I wanted to have sooner. But once I learned that, like, I felt like everything that I got into and every person I met and every opportunity that came my way, I was having fun with it, whether it was a success or a failure. So definitely that fail as many times as you can. Fail with grace, fail without grace, like just fail all the time, and then your successes will come after that. And then like have fun. Like it is hard and sometimes it's really serious, but you have to find those moments in between where you can relax, you can take a break, you can have fun with your friends, you can do absolutely nothing and have a great time doing it. Like that is super important, not only to like your mental health, but like your physical well-being and like helping you get through those 4 years, because it is rough. And just finding that community. Like I honestly don't think I would have made it through if I didn't have the friends I had and I didn't have the supports I had, especially because I was away from home. And I wasn't that far away from home, but nonetheless, 4 years away from your family that you spent kind of every day with, that's kind of a tough pill to swallow, or at least it was for me. So find that sense of community and those people that really help you become who you're supposed to be.
Can I add one thing real quick? My other piece of advice for all college people is that it's going to be okay, no matter what. Even if you don't get a job right out of college, you'll find something. Like everything is going to work out the way that it's supposed to. And I remember being in your shoes and just being like, oh my God, what if I don't get a job? What if I don't have that internship offer? What if I don't get where I want to go? And ultimately, life plays out and you'll be where you want to be. And if not, you'll keep fighting to get there, and you will one day.
I'll keep it brief, but I think, if I look back, I was, when I was in college, I had this plan. I was obsessed with sticking to the plan. I scheduled everything. And when I look back on it, I realized how I feel like I missed out on just having a sort of an unplanned, fun time in college in a lot of situations, and I think to kind of make that a little broader, what I would say is your life is not a linear narrative. It's never going to be, and if you expect it to be, you're going to constantly feel like you're not meeting whatever standard or whatever goals you think you need to meet at a given time, and you're going to make yourself miserable doing it. So expecting a linear narrative or a linear trajectory is not only is it unrealistic, but it's no way to live a life. It's a miserable way to live a life. In my case, I graduated from college. I worked in one industry for a while. went back to culinary school, did something totally different, and kind of did a whole bunch of things. And ultimately, that's what got me here. And frankly, I wouldn't have gotten here had I. So it was only at the point at which I stopped thinking about this singular, monotonic, sort of linear trajectory that I really started to kind of feel like myself and kind of feel like I was in my own skin. I spent a lot of time trying to meet a standard that I thought was what I should meet instead of just doing what I thought felt right.
Well, again, I wanted to say you all are an absolute blessing. I want to say thank you again for sharing, and it's been absolutely wonderful to hear your candor and your honesty, and I just couldn't be more grateful. And with that, that's the end of this conversation. I hope you tune in for our future ones.
Yes, thank you so much, Abby, for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Abby.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Bye.
Great job, Abby, Professor Delta, Jada. It's so great to see everyone. Thank you so much, Abby, for organizing this.
Thank you. I'm glad we were able to have it all work out and everyone was able to